But nowadays, that's no longer the rule in a lot of countries around the world. They've been granted the authority by the central bank and by the government, by their banking license, to lend out money and basically create this out of thin air, to put it in your bank account so that you can spend it. And then obviously the risk is, and this is why they are so stringent, especially in Luxembourg, which is AAA rated for its creditworthiness, is they make sure that you can pay it back. So if you work in a government position here in Luxembourg, if you default on that loan, the government will step in and pay it. And so banks are a lot more willing to give you a loan in that sense because they know that that asset on their balance sheet will be paid off. But yeah, it comes out of thin air, and they add those numbers, those digits to a balance sheet, and then it's on your bank account. And that's kind of how commercial banks are in that liquidity and that money creation business.
So you've mentioned Luxembourg. We're here in Luxembourg. And whenever I meet somebody and say, oh, I live in Luxembourg, they automatically think, oh, Luxembourg's a very wealthy place. It's all about money. It's got a reputation for being very strong. We know there's a lot of people who work in finance here. But people who don't work in the financial fields, they don't know why Luxembourg became famous for its financial centres. So I'd love you to give us a brief history of why finance came to Luxembourg and how.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting story that I know not that many people know. What's really interesting, and I'll start this story actually where I live currently. So I live in Belval, which is one of the hotspots of our steel industry, right? Which it was a few years ago. You can see all of the big iron furnaces there, which they've left. I think it's very beautiful. For anyone who hasn't been to Belval, please go and visit. You can actually go and tour these different iron furnaces. Now, why do I say this? Well, Luxembourg in the 1950s was one of the biggest steel exporters in the world. And that was a big part of the economy. I think if you speak to a lot of old Luxembourgish people, they will have known, or one of their family members worked in the steel industry, either in the administrative side or in one of these, steel plants, as you would say.
And that's to do with, of course, the land of Luxembourg, which has very rich iron ore in the south of Luxembourg, which is where you're saying. So that was a commodity we actually had in the ground.
Yeah, exactly. And, in Luxembourg, we call it the Forge du Sud. So that was, the South was really known for that. And so that was really good for our economy. And post-World War II, we really, around the world, we increased our production possibilities of steel. And there was a lot of demand as people were rebuilding things that, were broken, or you needed to build new infrastructure when we were going into this next era. But then the 1970s came, and I know South Korea and Japan also started exporting steel, sometimes cheaper, sometimes quicker, giving a lot of competition to obviously Luxembourgish steel production. And overall, the demand for steel started to go down a little bit because now we're already 10, 20 years into it. A lot of countries, they have a lot of the steel that they need for the infrastructure. Sure, there's still demand, but it's not the same. And if your economy has been built on just growing this part of the economy the whole time, and demand starts to drop a little bit, or there's a competitor who can do it better, it becomes very difficult. And then Luxembourg made in my opinion, fantastic decision at the time to basically make sure that we make Luxembourg as attractive as possible for financial institutions. Now, how did we do that? Well, we made sure that we made the tax laws very favorable for financial institutions, financial service companies. And we made sure that the regulation was in place to give these financial institutions the clarity for how they could operate their businesses here.
And why was it that when this was happening in Luxembourg, and it was seen to be happening, other neighbouring countries didn't do the same?
We have one big advantage in Luxembourg, and that is that we move pretty quickly. I see this now, and I will get into that later on, but in the blockchain digital asset space, when things are discussed in the EU and there's different directives given, because of the size of our country, we can move very quickly. And that's a huge advantage in this sense, because as it happens in business a lot, the first mover normally takes the biggest chunk of the market. And because we provided that certainty, that was huge. Now, there are some other things that make Luxembourg super attractive. It's not just that regulatory certainty and the tax piece, but we are also in Central Europe, which means it's very close to all of these other European nations. We have a lot of multilingual speakers in Luxembourg with many different diverse cultures, making us very good for cross-border services in Europe, but also outside of Europe. So Luxembourg really has quite a few qualities that you would probably look for if you are trying to create a financial hub around the world.
And then 1963 was important. We have the first Eurobond listed.
Yeah. So very quickly, for those that maybe don't know what a bond is. So a bond is pretty much a loan that a company or a government can put out. So you and I can buy a bond today from the US government, from a different company, and basically we will give that company or government the money and they will make interest payments. So in a way, think of it as almost like you're the bank. You're lending out money now, but you're actually lending out money. You're not just taking out of thin air.
And investors often like bonds because they feel safer than other investments.
Yeah, that's very, very good point. And I think, because you get that money back at the end of it. So whatever I lend you, that €1,000 or whatever, I'll get it back and I'll get interest payments normally twice a year for it. And so what that allowed us to do, or what financial services companies, was that you were now able to raise money from all around the world with this Euro bond, making it very attractive to get capital in here if you had your financial services company or hub here in Luxembourg.
And then we have gone through a few different crises, but Luxembourg has always managed to ride the wave. And you mentioned before, we have tight regulation, we have the AAA rating. And so this again gives that layer of certainty and trust, and funds, investors, they want this, they need this anchor point, they need a point of safety.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you think of it yourself, in any point of crises, who are you most likely going to leave last or trust the most? It's the person who's most trustworthy, who has the most credibility. And so the money in crises, what people are looking for is a safe haven. This is why people buy gold in crises when, inflation is rampant or there's uncertainty. You can see the price of gold go up, and that's because the demand for gold starts going up. And similarly, what's really nice about Luxembourg, and we need to have a good balance there so that we still attract entrepreneurs, so we still attract emerging markets, but because we are so stable, at least still currently, as a financial hub, people don't necessarily think of Luxembourg as the first place to pull their money out of. And that's really important in crises when people are thinking about, okay, where do I place my money? High net worth individuals or even financial institutions that are thinking about moving their money. Luxembourg's not the first place that I think is on their list to move money out of.
And there was another point in 1988 where we had an EU fund rule that you might need to explain out to us a little bit. Luxembourg was the first to say yes to this. And then we have this acronym called UCITS directive, which I would like you to explain to our audience what UCITS are, and talk to us also about the EU fund rule of 1988.
Yeah, no, I think that was another pivotal moment. So as in the 1970s, we obviously made it more favorable for financial services companies to come here. Great. But then the other thing that we saw in 1988 when the UCITS directive came out was that basically we made it very favorable for the fund industry to be here. And the big rule that was basically introduced with UCITS was that you could now market your fund in Europe entirely while being based in Luxembourg. And again, we moved so quickly. Other countries could have done the same, but we moved very quickly. And because we had already built this reputation of trust in this financial services industry, a lot of people saw it. Okay, well, Luxembourg's moving quick again. We got to move in there. And now what's really, really interesting is we are actually number 2 in the world in funds under management, behind the US. Now, the US has over 350 million people. We have just over 600,000, even though I would have to look up on those numbers because I feel like it's growing every year. But that's astonishing. We have $7 trillion under alternative investment funds in Luxembourg.
I think it's about 660,000.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. But I think you also need to tell us what are UCITS?
Yeah. So UCITS are basically like... It's it allows us to have a fund here in Luxembourg, and it's from what I remember still when I was reading up on it, is it's really the regulation that surrounds the fund industry and solidifies the fact that all of these different rules that you have of how you can establish the fund, who you can market to, and what capital you can draw in.
So in the world, is Luxembourg still a good place to come to work in finance?
I definitely think it is. I think especially now, I think in January, if I'm not mistaken, we just passed a rule that for certain talent coming from abroad, we are giving a 50% tax exemption.
Yes, it's unbelievable. Yes, for anybody who wants to come and live here, there are some incredible incentives right now, and they are brilliant. You're right. I think for 1 or 2 years there's 50% tax break. There's all sorts of other things. So that's unbelievable if you want to come and live here. But you might also have the question, why is it that Luxembourg is doing this? And you also mentioned, you were joking at the fact that for a tiny, tiny studio flat of 100,000 euros, you actually wouldn't get that in Luxembourg. So we have competitors within Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all know, and businesses know this the best,